Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 20th paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of Vom Krige, the title being, "Therefore the element of chance, it only is wanting to make of war a game, and in that element it is least of all deficient." The text follows. We see from the foregoing how much the objective nature of war makes it a calculation of probabilities. Now there is only one single element still wanting to make it a game, and that element it certainly is not without. It is chance. There is no human affair which stands so constantly and so generally in close connection with chance as war. But together with chance, the accidental, and along with it good luck, occupy a great place in war. So this is a very short paragraph, as you have just listened, but it's very important. I mean, of course, all von Clausewitz's paragraphs are kind of important. I tell it every time. But this one is particularly, albeit, it doesn't really, von Clausewitz will fundamentally develop this concept in the following paragraphs, but this is more like a definition, like observing that, especially this phrase, that there is no human affair which stands so constantly and so generally in close connection with chance as war. This leads to potentially infinite amount of considerations can be drawn. Let's analyze a little bit the phrases that are very simple. So we see from the foregoing, so for what was explained in previous paragraphs, how much the objective nature of war makes it a calculation of probabilities. In the previous paragraphs we have seen, if you have watched, if you have followed the videos, that fundamentally there is always a degree of probabilities that you have to take into account for something to happen into war, which in turn derives from the lack of knowledge, fundamentally, of that the single actor, single fighter has in war, concerning really everything it has in front of his eyes, but also within himself, because being in charge of a certain army, of a certain unit, doesn't make you at all actually all-knowing about what's going on, even there. So even if every assessment was done correctly, still there is a time, still there is a other elements that can intervene at every moment. So therefore everything that you have to base your decisions on is fluid, is in movement, is in constant evolution, is in constant transformation. So you can't fundamentally grasp it at the same moment. This is a neurological problems that happens literally in every human affair. Only the time that takes for our brain to process the informations that come throughout our senses is effectively making us living in a sort of past, in a lagging, let's say, behind reality as it evolves, and ultimately our task is to understand what happens all around in order to live in reality, and we do it by a certain degree of approximation in every activity. So this is important to relate with the Clausewitzian concept that war is the human affair to which chance intervenes more constantly, more generally, because it's in many ways, and in a smaller range, a way that fundamentally occurs in every other situation, so that you can understand by yourself. It's like, say, studying even what happens in war. Since we cross with military history and all this stuff, we know that fundamentally it's very difficult to reconstruct the course of a battle, of a war, simply because we lack information. And we don't really know what happens. So when you're out there, and that's something you can do easily sitting on a chair at your home with books and stuff, but when you're out there on the field, what's happening is going to determine fundamentally how the whole thing you're surrounded but will evolve. And you're pressured by time, you're pressured by fear, by other emotions that naturally tend towards irrational directions that you have also to try to mitigate. So even this is a dynamic that consumes valuable energies and resources that are taken away from the calculation and the assessment of reality, etc. What von Clausewitz has told us in the previous paragraphs is fundamentally, when you take a decision in war, there is always a degree of risk attached to it. There is nothing like the perfect decision. A decision that has taken into consideration all what is going on and therefore has calculated the perfect solution, let's say. This is impossible. There is no science of war. There's never been, there will never be. War at best can be an art, which is wholly different. And therefore, this means that war is has by default, is attached by default with risk, which means that if you go out there, you can have even very favorable odds, but you still may lose pretty easily. And the thing evolves because it's not just like one shot, like the Russian roulette. You say fundamentally, okay, well, it's just one click, and you can more or less calculate what the probabilities are, even if you don't know them for sure, but and therefore you can assess that risk. But the problem with war is that the situation evolves. There are these reciprocal interactions that happen also with the enemy, that strikes back, that is not just a passive being that you can target just until it crumbles. It's something that strikes back. So there is much more that is added to the simple, single calculation of one chance, of one probability of something to happen. And the most difficult thing in war is probably to even figure out what among all these objects is going to take the greater influence on the others. I mean, it's not even difficult to understand sometimes, the probability that something will happen or the effect that it can have. The point is understanding of all the various factors, which is the one that's going to interfere the most. This also, we've made very frequently the same example that von Clausewitz does, that is essentially even at the end of a battle, for instance, of which you know more or less the outcome, you may never actually know what is that resulted decisive at the end of the day. You can surely make a list of determining factors that brought to that outcome altogether, as long as you know them, but you can never say, it's very hard to say at least that, this was the most important factor. Also because these factors, most of the times, are all in fact coming all together, partly by chance, and there is never like just one leading factor, because if you were to assume, I don't know, that numerical strength was the thing, obviously it's a banal and idiotic approximation, but just to make you understand, it's never that. There are tons of other factors that intervene. Numbers, okay, what about quality? What about the environment? What about knowledge? What about the leadership? And these are all factors that altogether never can individually, can take over, can get the upper hand over the others, so bending them to the result. And things evolve in very different ways. Just today, for instance, I was writing about a battle from the 14th century. I was studying this, and there was for instance, a kind of clear dynamic of how the fight actually took place. But that is already very complicated to do by itself, which we never know most of the times how battles were actually fought. But you can't. There were several factors. This was a medieval, yeah, okay, I said it, 14th century battle. You know, there were several elements. The ground they had to take into consideration. The knowledge about the enemy. There was one side that didn't think the enemy was combat ready and just was pressing on him, advancing in a kind of a, you know, in poor order, let's say, and eventually, you know, found the enemy standing in front of them and creating a problem. There is a, you know, at a certain point, the first rank of this army is lured by the enemy across a river, and then is attacked by the first rank of the enemy army. And it's extremely complicated. There are crossbows, there are cavalry charges. What is it really made that battle finishing the way it did ultimately? We can't really know, and historical sources are, after all, not that different from actual combat reports, from, you know, the same ones that the commander can get at that point. Naturally, that commander had, you know, in that case, a kind of a good view of the battlefield. It could address our troops, but we don't really know what was in his mind, and you don't know what's in the enemy's mind at the same time. So this creates a set of factors, let's say a system, that becomes at large imperscrutable, because you can't really solve the equation that you need in order to, you know, to understand certain things, because there are too many variables that you effectively do not know. So the same thing might have, you know, might have even had a decisive impact, but it might have been even kind of a insignificant, virtually insignificant one. So this is why von Clausewitz puts here that there is no human affair which stands so constantly and so generally in close connection with chance as war. Because chance at that point is not just a lack, it doesn't really come from a lack of knowledge. Here von Clausewitz is introducing another concept more thoroughly. It's not just about the calculation of probabilities in the way, you know, dictated by our lack of knowledge. This calculation of probabilities has to take into account things that effectively still have to occur, that you may have not foreseen, that could happen in the first place. So it's not just a direct view of what you have in front of you, it's also to be able to foretell what will go on dynamically in this process, even before the event that you're gonna calculate the probabilities of which will eventually verify itself. So it's like a game. This is the conclusion that von Clausewitz gets to at this point. And the only element that effectively was missing in the description, in the objective description, as he, you know, quite importantly observes, was chance. The idea of chance, the idea that by itself, like in a game, there is no, I mean, no, there would never be a game where, you know, where everything is gonna end anyway. Games are designed in a fashion, or they happen to be with a set of rules, etc. Exactly something that can end in many different ways, depending on several factors, including decision making. So it's like a card game that already, also last time we remember von Clausewitz compares to war, in fact, because when you start a card game, it's always those number of cards. The rules can be very simple, but effectively when you start, you don't know how it's going to end. You can make certain calculations, like by saying, you know, that there is a certain random chance that I will get those cards, for instance, that are more that can, you know, they're more valuable, but you still, and you may even calculate that mathematically speaking, because it's in fact a matter of probabilities, But until you can get them, you can't effectively know what will happen. So the calculation of probability is always very theoretical in itself, because you can measure, you're measuring something that until you don't actually get into, you can't tell what will happen, how it will happen like. And that's why chances and probabilities in this situation are the ineliminable element in war as well. And you have to take it as a standard. And so there is nothing more, let's say, less predictable in its outcomes in human affair, but war. And this is not just like, when you read Von Clausewitz, you don't have to think that these quotes are just thrown there to impress you. Whoa, that's war, so cool. No, it's not. It's actually like that. I mean, objectively, in human affairs, that's the war is the one that has this constant, and that is so generally connected to chance of all the others, because it's an extremely complex system, and it's directed to an aim. This is also particularly important because it's obvious that you can say, well, okay, what happens normally into a society, for instance, maybe the same society that is actually fighting that war, is enormously more complicated. So effectively, that is a much more troublesome system in many ways than just the army fighting somewhere. Yes, it's narrower, it's more confined, but in war you have a certain aim that in society effectively you don't have. It's obvious that there are way more complex systems than war in itself. War is included into a larger system, that is the worlds, the universes. But that's not the point, because the world and the universe do not have such an aim, like, compelling your enemy to fulfill your will through the use of force, like war is. In war you have that, and that also has, let's say, it's like a time, it's like a timed process that has this, that war is, when war is fought, there is an actual urgency to reach that objective. So it's not just something that happens, that starts, nobody notices that. In order for violence to break out, to be used by politics in order to achieve certain goals, well, you must have very determined goals. You have to be wanting to achieve something that is possibly contained, that targeted, and that has to be carried out, hopefully, in the quickest way as possible. You can't just lingering into it as if I just make armies staying there. No, because war, by the way, costs a freaking lot, and you have to make an effort in order to fight. So just look at history and look at how costly things like war are. Just look at how much a jet consumes in terms of fuel for every single mission. It's like billions, and that's just a single jet going to maybe throw a bomb or two. Just imagine a world war, and just imagine historically, for anyone who knows war generally, how it also exists. It has always been made up for one of the greatest expanses of humanity, of states, chiefly during a given time. Most of the military history we cover is in fact the history of a war, of endemic war, that in that sense was even an instrument for development, in paradoxically given that war destroys, but the whole society was committed into it. Just yesterday we were talking about this seigneurial system in post-Carolingian Europe. Well, that was a world that was basically all about war, and in which resources were continuously produced and consumed, largely to feed that, in order to expand. So you realize how this is such a complex phenomenon that always invested human societies, and that has always been tied to, ultimately, to chance. So it's always been something extremely daring, adventurous, and dramatically. Also, things can definitely go worse, and they do kind of they tend definitely to get worse over time. Generally, aside from independently from the who is faring better wars, the world situation still degenerates rapidly, costs a lot, consumes energies, makes you tired, makes things, resources being worn out. Excuse me. And you have to get it to get it done quickly if you really want it to be something effective and profitable for you as well. So there is, let's say, a fundamental space in war given to chance. Basically, war gravitates around this calculation of probabilities, and the idea that these probabilities are not just to be considered a priori, like, before the war, I just imagine how things could go, and then I start the war, more or less what happens remains within the boundaries of what I had foreseen. No, everything can change dramatically, and it can backfire, because that's fundamentally how it goes many times. If you assume that, I don't know, for all the times that someone attacked just to be defeated eventually, or that defended just to pass on the attack, well, that was not expected, initially speaking, but it could happen. We talk about even basically all the conflicts in history that evolved in such a similar manner. There's always a moment of resistance that can... if you study military history, you realize that there's always a moment in which, okay, maybe the odds are particularly favorable structurally, systemically, to a certain for a certain fighter, right? But in the moment in which violence is in combat proper, there are always certain moments to which there is this obstacle to surpass. And generally, as also von Clausewitz explained, this obstacle is never something, that you're gonna use literally all the forces you have in order to overcome. Rarely societies make wars like putting on, let's say, on the putting at stakes its wall power, right? You have a set of battles in a campaign that more or less shift that they're made even just to test the ground. Pretty rarely there is a fight between someone who already knows it will be annihilated. This is also particularly important sometimes because it's politics eventually that dominates the whole thing. If there is a big system that is able to swallow another one, just, I don't know, economically speaking, you don't need war, you just need to wait a little bit. When there is violence involved, it's usually, and hopefully, especially for the attacker, to get it done quickly, but at the same time, it's a sort of very intensive effort that normally, that is very, exceptional in its nature. Violence in itself, when it breaks out, it's really something rare, taken into comparison of all the other human activities. It's not that we are... Conflict is always there. Conflict is at the base of every single relation that exists within human beings. We're always at conflict with anyone. And conflict is something very subtle to understand. We think at conflict as something dramatic, but everything is conflictual. Everything is polemically put in human society in a way or another. But the outbreak of violence is really not. So when this is done, it's usually also is an implicit admission in many ways of, okay, we need to be violent because what we want to achieve is very difficultly obtainable otherwise, or at least it would take a lot of time. Violence is this extreme with a very high deterrent force already in itself, even aside from the actual exertion of force. But it's already something that, you know, when a war it's a serious breaks out, it's something serious. It's a serious business. You don't treat it lightheartedly. Of course, violence is employed very widely in many forms, even surgically speaking. Think of all the, I don't know, covert ops that operations that happen all over the world at all moments now. But when you talk about, you know, really having to defeat someone, you realize that the odds that existed historically were never kind of almost completely favorable or disfavorable to someone. More or less, if someone used force and the other struck back, it's because more or less there is a balance that at that point it has nothing to do with, you know, how big is the guy, how big are and how powerful are these guys, but also what what this war is fought for, where, and generally with which objectives that, as we have seen in von Clausewitz, are effectively the ones that determine even the willingness to keep on fighting, for instance. So, chance, this is just for saying that aside from the theoretical abstraction, in actual military history, wars are fought always with, tendentially at least, with a very high chance that the result can be very different, into which chance really plays a big part even in the outcome, the ultimate outcome of the conflict. So very rarely you have in reality two sides that are extremely determined and that fight till the death, till the annihilation. Even when you have pretty big powers, it's never like that. There are countless historical examples of more powerful states that were brought to withdraw fundamentally from a certain conflict because they didn't want to spend that much, or simply was not convenient for them, or they didn't have the interests. And most of conflict breaks out in violence today in this kind of apparently soft forms. When did countries, declared war for the last time? I mean, today it's really, everything is made of, and it's always been so, by the way, of smaller operations. Let's say we have been raised in this 19th century ideal for which, everything was extremely formal. If a country just, shot one bullet to another, a war had to break out immediately. But it's never been like that. De facto, there's never been this formality. There's never been this mechanicistic functioning between, two states that simply had this immediate force immediate will to fight and to commit themselves thoroughly into a major war by themselves. It's never been so, and it keeps not being so. And today we can observe it from, in fact, how from what we listen to from the media every day, more or less. Of course, the media are not very good at explaining us what is happening out there in the world, but it's all about that. Here, that ship has been sunk, that place has been bombed, that place has been attacked. There's been this interventions in there. That places, the other places been raided by people who, I don't know, have hijacked, have some, I don't know, that it's plenty of actual violence that is committed, and that tends to form the pattern of today's conflicts, like they've always been in the past. And so the Clausewitzian concept here is particularly useful for you to understand how this works, how this system develops, because, or better, it doesn't make sense, the system develops to say, but how the relations within the various powers actually occur, and how the forces that drive them are operating within them as well, so that we can't talk anymore, but this also never actually existed, historically speaking, of just one country that has that control over its territory, and it's all about that. No, because now everything that happens even within it, within communications, with people's ideas, changes everything, and it's always been so. That's also why studying, for instance, medieval history is extremely useful, because you see that I think most of the interest that exists towards medieval age is still kind of nationalistic. Like, I see it every day from the combatants. There's always someone who says, I belong to that nation, so that back in the medieval age we were those guys, we had that flag, we fought for that. It was never like that. The intersections here, the double crosses, all the various internal balances were something that made the systems always continuously fluid. And the Middle Ages are very useful for this, because being a rather politically fragmented period, that shows you more clearly how, and with less hypocrisy, let's say, how the whole thing worked. But not even when you had great empires or great states or great nations, you can't actually say that that empire was kind of immune to everything that happened externally, that internally everything was kind of fine, unitary or unitarily oriented. Was never like that. It keeps being like that, and it will always be like that. So what von Clausewitz teaches you here is always to consider that literally everything changes at all times, that there has never been a single thing that has been equal to another, historically, fortunately speaking, that there is no single person on this earth that is equal to another, not even one, and ever, by definition. And this is very powerfully also from a philosophical point of view, because this shouldn't paradoxically lead to let's say, okay, everything is a mess. No, it's not like that. There are still patterns that are followed. There are dynamics that are, but that can be observed and circumscribed in some way. But these dynamics are always relative to a system that changes. That always changes. So von Clausewitz teaches you to reason far beyond dichotomies, like dualistic dichotomies of everything starts from the idea of conflict as well. What is a conflict? Von Clausewitz fundamentally talks about war, because that's what and in real war, which is what he's fundamentally interested in. But the moral of the story, let's say, that he tells us is that everything that happens into this particular domain, because war does have a domain of its own, but it always is always influenced and controlled and modified by what happens outside. So there is a big difference between conflict and war in this sense, because conflict is something that pre-exists war, that actually leads to war as defined as the use of force, because this is what war is. There is no other way to put it. So even the idea of a declaration of war or it's kind of meaningless. In fact, as I often say, one of the most difficult things in absolute terms when talking about military history is to say, okay, when do I start telling the story from? Because if you start literally when, one country has invaded another one, just imagine I had to explain to you World War II. How do you explain it? You even wanted to stick to Europe because there were other conflicts going on, things about China and Japan, or Italy and Ethiopia, or other things like that. 1939, 1st September. The Nazis set foot in and they crossed the border with Poland. They invade Poland, and I start telling the history of World War II from there. But how can you even possibly understand that if you don't know what brought to that? Doesn't make sense. Throw the history book away because you can't understand that effectively. Of course, this is kind of radical. Never throw any history book. I would say some have. I have very rarely dismissed certain reads because they were too bad, but it happens. But in general, it's not a good idea to destroy books in any way, as they are the basis of our civilization, fortunately. But the point I was making, I think, it was pretty clear. You can't understand war if you don't frame it into this eternally changing I call it system, assuming that systems have are finite and they have a boundary, but actually we're out here in the universe, and you can't extend that to so many factors, but you must know what happens before. You must know what drives to certain decisions, because it's always about the decision. There is nothing actually mechanical in war. Even when you see those programs like, I don't know, the Deadliest Warrior and stuff like that, what's the biggest mistake of those things? Because they try to replicate a fight in a test tube, in a completely aseptic, impersonal way. Like, put two people in front of one another. Let's assume that they are trained to use their weapons in a certain way and see who kills each other. And what reasons do those guys have to kill each other? How much value do they give to their own lives? Human lives have a price. They've always had. Sadly enough, there is a cost for human life. You can find out there in the market. There is actual, quantifiable thing. And none of us costs, the same way, by the way. Sadly, but it is true. So, how are those gonna fight? How can you explain war if you into the equation you don't bring certain volatile, but at the same time very important elements like hate? How can you study war if you don't know hate? If you don't understand hate, if you don't understand killing, if you don't understand what it means to see a person die, well, it's impossible. And how can you quantify that? How can you can't quantify the push that the loss of a person can give you? So you will never find any good military historian that doesn't care about this, that wants things to be kind of theoretical, aseptical, and just to find the right equation. And this is actually, in a nutshell, the point of history is that you never find a real answer at the end of the day. You can get very close to it, though, which is what really, by approximation, leads us. Just like in war, because in war, you can't pretend to know what's going on out there at all times. There is always this chance surrounding you, influencing at all time. But there is a practice, an experience, an intelligence that guides you through this. It may lead you, towards completely different directions because of chance, because of randomness. But still there is a guide into this. So this is particularly important because One thing is to assess chance by saying, okay, I have no power to decide what will happen. But chance is actually assessed when you need to know what you have to do. This is dramatically important. You know, if we actually saw how, aside from the fact of aside our mortality, but you know, all the things that may happen to us in every second, we would live in an anti-atomic shelter far from everyone, from every germ, from any, you know, any other human being. But guess what? We don't. And we get out there in the world. We get through very risky stuff. We do very rational stuff. We still do it for our purposes that lead us. And there is no way in assessing chance and in understanding its truest meaning and the impossibility of being certain about something until you don't need to do that something. And that's why in war, chance assumes this enormous importance, because in war you're actually very determined. You really want to achieve that result most of the time. So I think varies also in here, and it influences, in fact, your willingness to fight and to go on with this. And chance can effectively tell you, you know, look, you may want to bail out from this for now because it's too risky, for example. But if you are using violence, you're already pressured enough to be willing to take that risk. And in fact, what is also particularly important in here is that the calculation of probability requires intelligence. So that's why in war, intelligence normally is the winning element, because at least, you know, normally it's not force, let's say, in itself, because you may be a very strong fighter, but if you don't know how to use your force in this mess that appears in front of you, that force is of no use. This would open also to another chapter, that is the one on doctrine. How is that we really applied forces to achieve victory, etc. But you have to sort things out. So if there wasn't chance, really, war would look like that absolute that von Clausewitz has in fact used exactly to demonstrate ex absurdo what we're telling right now. Because in the primordial thing, it's just like two fighters wanted to kill one another. Von Clausewitz teaches us how this is not real. How in real war, everything gets mitigated by other factors. Into which chance basically pushes you to say, wait, I have to be careful about what I'm doing. That's why courage and force and strength, let's say, are not enough. People are convinced that it's strong people or courageous people that win wars. You can't imagine how many people out there honestly believe that, you know, war comes from, you know, being, victory comes from being courageous. Sadly, it's not so. Some of the most courageous people in the world have been slaughtered and turned to ashes, and we know nothing about their names, their lives, their identity. We don't even know that they ever existed, because that didn't save them from annihilation. Sometimes it is about force, overwhelming use of force, but most of the times, in real history, it's about intelligence. It's about sorting out how what your options are fundamentally, and what's the best one you can pick. I was thinking about another thing now. I think I forgot, but I think the sense is clear. Chance helps you to grow more intelligent, because the more you're put in front of difficulties, and the more you the more the difficulty increases, and the more you find sophisticated, the more sophisticated means you find in order to solve those problems, to overcome those difficulties. And it's not a few. I think every person can relate to this, even intellectually speaking. I mean, where were you 10 years ago? Were you more intelligent than now? Well, probably, at least you don't have, unfortunately, some health problem, or things are gonna deteriorate ultimately. But chances are that at least intellectually you're more developed than 10 years ago. Intellectually meant in a very neutral way. I mean, in the sense of what are your intellectual skills, your intelligence fundamentally, and that's because you're likely been through way more things that you had been through before, and you've probably also because the more you progress, the more powerful you become. Let's be honest about this. It's like in actual military history when you find an army that is the product of centuries of warfare, or maybe the single army is made up of veterans. We've already seen it all before, and you have an inherent quality in there that can get lost. That army can be annihilated, but at the same time, chances are that it's a tougher nut to crack than an army of rookies is. So this has a very deep meaning, because war pressures you constantly. So you get into the meat grinder, and the solutions you have to find are pretty. You have to take them. You have to find them soon. Otherwise, you're dead. So even when you study military history, never think that you are smarter than the people who were in there, that you could have done better, or that everything was kind of so easy that you know best, because chances are you don't know anything about it. And studying military history teaches you exactly this, that it's already a huge problem to understand reality as it was. You can imagine, this reality filtered through other people at centuries of distance, just to arrive to you, who pretends to pontificate about things that you will never have the palest idea of. So history in this teaches you to be humble and say, okay, if I don't know something, I can't objectively prove anything. And most of the time what you have is just a set of hints, of traces, of elements that maybe altogether, because this is what often happens, maybe can give you back, render you back a frame, let's say, of one picture, one dynamic, but will never actually solve the equation by themselves. Because the same equation is rigged. As long as just one little variable is unknown, you can't know what the whole thing was. And this is so very mathematical at the same time. Of course, there are certain variables that are more or less important, but at the end of the day, what von Clausewitz teaches you is that if you, however, get, this frame, you have a pattern that you can confrontate with others, and that generally turns out in a certain way. That's where it turns out to be kind of constant in some ways, and it's only through this very difficult process that you can start using a military logic into reality. Because unless you don't have until you don't have experience of reality, let's say, either through direct military experience or studying military history, with great difficulty you can distinguish what is plausible from what is implausible. And what is interesting of the Vom Krige is that it's fundamentally the product of both things, because von Clausewitz was both a general that had risen through the ranks, and a military historian. So a guy who saw war both on the battlefield in a personal way. We'll see now. Also, I think von Clausewitz speaks about this pretty soon, or relatively soon, at least in our progression of the Vom Krige. But he has also put together all other elements and informations from other people. And he had made an inquiry, fundamentally. You remember during the introduction of the Vom Krige, he says, I've been talking, not just I've been through actual warfare and seen it, these historical events, etc., Napoleonic Wars, but I've also been talking to people who were renowned, soldiers that had been through certain things and were kind of reliable, because he made a great historical work in many ways. The Vom Krige doesn't start from a theoretical, an abstract philosophical background. Some readers may be tricked, because as we've seen now with the first paragraphs, he definitely starts from a very theoretical abstraction, but he does it already having in mind what he has found out firsthand, and in this sense kind of going in reverse and showing you the whole thing from the general, and then eventually getting down to the more concrete world, let's say, and going by logical processes. So never mistake the Vom Krige for a theoretical analysis of war, because von Clausewitz doesn't talk about theoretical war. He talks only about real war. And what people tend to do is the other way around all the time. They try to abstract by saying, war is so different, so diverse. So what do? First of all, I abstract. And they start building the theory from out of nothing, basically. Out of making this sterile and aseptic. Von Clausewitz was writing in polemics exactly against this theoretical abstraction, against this positivistic attitude that was pretty much in vogue, actually, at the time, in the 19th century. And guess what was survived to inform the military theory of all the nations worldwide, of all the militaries worldwide, the Clausewitzian thought. And all the time I'm struck by the in fact the general forgetfulness of von Clausewitz worldwide around. This is a person who really changed the face of history forever. Without von Clausewitz, there would have not been the German unification. There would have not been, the Soviet Revolution would have failed. It really changed the face of the world, and we don't actually know even what this person is. Now, if you don't know, some of you had the great intelligence and honesty to say, I don't know what von Clausewitz is. Don't worry, it's normal. I'm making a general consideration as a society. I mean, even if people who count something in politics, even in the military, or would teach the military, because this is the case of figures like, I don't want to make name, but if you take Keegan or other, these are people who, okay, we don't have time to talk about this, but they're dreaming. And the only reason why there are people who criticize von Clausewitz, it's because they don't understand von Clausewitz. It's always like that. This happened also to great minds like Jomini, who was the greatest rival of von Clausewitz. And at the end of the day, he said, you know what, this is a genius. He was right. And Jomini was a very intelligent person, in fact. And he also wrote many interesting things, but still with an extreme difference, let's say, in terms of what the essentials of the theory really were. There would be, talking about von Clausewitz is so cool. I'm actually very happy. I'm sorry that you're not very interested in it, as it from the views, but please, if you just are listening to me right now, by chance you're not interested, please go read the Vom Krige. Even a translation, let's say, it depends. Even, of course, we're not experts I mean, I'm not an expert of Vom Krige. I should have much better, linguistical, philosophical, and even military understanding than I should be in order to speak about him. But I think the essentials can be grasped, even by someone who, just knows von Clausewitz from the day before and wants to read him. It's fine as long as you read him. And when you read him, just like with anything, just not say, oh well, this is just saying a pile of bollocks. It's not interesting. Always be humble, because knowledge, experience, and intelligence tell you to be humble, teach you to be humble, and it can't be otherwise. And this is what von Clausewitz is telling to you as well. Be humble, because what happens all around you all the time is dictated by chance. Is really dictated by chance, and in many ways, this also has many great philosophical implications, because some of the greatest philosophies and religions in the world start essentially from this. Human life is beautiful, definitely, it's great. I personally agree with this statement, but at the same time it also has a lot of sufferance, a lot of pain, and guess what? There is most of the times no one who can take you out of the problems but yourself. So if you learn to struggle, if you learn how to be independent, if you learn that fundamentally there are so many factors that can intervene to crush your life from a moment to another, you can stay, which hopefully will not happen, but I wish you really with all my heart that, unless you're not a very, very evil person, that also will happen. But the best way to get through it is to not to say, okay, well, we are doomed, let's kill ourselves. That's a morally relativistic and destructive attitude. Just get yourself skilled. You will never make it to reach the truth, but at least you will kind of get closer to it, and you will try to, sort things out more effectively. Because this is, at the end of the day, what life is, as grim as it may sound, because there is always much greater effort to do than what we wish we could ever be able to do. But it turns out that it's the only way to do things well, and civilization was built effectively through this. And war is one of the best examples of this effort, because sometimes we attach very very negative meaning to it, a very very moral judgment about the fact that war is evil. War in itself is not evil. It's people's intentions that can be good or evil, and war is just an instrument. And as long as you understand this, I think you get so much, because it teaches you both to understand Clausewitzian doctrine in this deeper understanding of war, but it also tells you so much about life, because life is really the same thing. It's not about how, say, physically strong you can ever get, or how even intelligence has its limits, actually, but everything is just a tool in your hand, in your mind, fundamentally, and it all starts from there. And the greatest problems, paradoxically, in our lives are also the most banal. Let's say how lazy you are, how willing you are to pressure yourself to reach a goal, a result. Most of what our failures actually stem from this idea: I don't want to study today because I'm lazy, I don't want, and then you're gonna regret of it. And it's even natural, I mean, it's instinctual, it's how we are programmed. But at the same time, if you want to improve in any way, you have to go against this. And the only way you have to do it is trying to sort things out. For how difficult can it be? It will never happen. Chance will always be there to ruin a part of it, but still you will have done something by that point, which is still better than idling. And if you allow me another final consideration of his strictly historical nature, I think that if you look at many histories, many civilizations, you realize that that the development, or the main the maturation and the maturity, let's say, of certain civilizations actually passed through war. I mean, in all the great civilizations in history, there's been fundamentally a moment of struggle that passed through these conflicts, and sometimes through open war. A war that, in this sense, helped civilization to sort things out, to grow intellectually, to grow mentally. And what is interesting about this is that usually you don't go back, because even though you tend to be lazy, you still, when you acquire certain knowledge, very difficultly you will go back. I mean, there are surely certain back and forths, like in history, there are certain knowledge and wisdom that are lost for some reasons that are sometimes structural and material, so they intervene to, in this kind of very hard fact dimension that also counts in our life. But at the same time, when you have reached a stage of intelligence, let's say, it's very difficult you will go in reverse, because you may grow lazier, you may throw it all in the bin in this sense, but at the same time you will have more capacity to go beyond, and war has accelerated this dramatically. Take technology, take even politics in itself. War has taught us even what kind of direction to take sometimes. I think it's undeniable that we live in a moment where there is a moral stagnation, because we aren't pressured anymore. Doesn't necessarily take just war. It might also take poverty and sufferance in general. But war, in this sense, accelerates this problem. So I believe that it's very debatable, but there was an added, additional morality that, I don't know, post-World War II Western civilization had, just having come out of the ashes of the World War, of the Holocaust, of the destruction of Europe, etc. That has added to the moral need to understand. Okay, now we have to rebuild. We have to do something good. Today, it's we aren't pressured enough. We don't know what to do with our lives. We get bored. We need to invent problems in order to feel ourselves fulfilled in some way. And it's not I'm generally optimistic, even if I tend to be to take pride from my neutrality most of the times in this sense, because I don't think I'm nor optimistic nor pessimistic, but for myself at least I understand there should be a purpose that has to be understood, because ultimately what may happen could always be beyond even our means of at least we should catch up with what the difficulties, the challenges are. We should grow. There should be a growth in civilization. Unfortunately, history tells us that it's not always the case. Civilizations can also regress, and I'm not saying we need another war, definitely another world war, but fortunately, hopefully not. But it's at the same time learning from these past events and refreshing our minds about what war in fact is, that can dramatically help us in the process. And definitely the Vom Krige is probably and possibly the most useful starting point, because it's also pretty neutral in himself. It's not a political book. I mean, it deals with politics of course, but it's not politically colored, let's say. It just tells you how certain dynamics intervene, and then you choose. Von Clausewitz is not an opinionist, like saying he writes his book just to say, okay, you have to do like I do. He just tells you, look, this is how it really happens. This has nothing to do with me. It's like more or less everybody who has studied these things knows. I mean, these things well, which is rare to do, but and if you want to do well next time, just take these things into consideration. That this is it. Then it doesn't tell you, go to war now, do this now. He didn't care. And it's interesting because he was, by the way, a man of his times, with his own opinions, with his own passions, with his own beliefs. So it also offers you a model, a method, a general pattern of behavior that can be useful for you. Generally speaking, the 19th century has produced great minds in the sense that just think about certain contemporaries like Kant or Hegel or others, that albeit very differently, and that have attempted to describe the world in the way it is, and to make it useful. What this emotionalism we live into now is meaningless, and I unfortunately think at least it will not have any legacy into this, because if you read Kant or Descartes or Aristotle, you're reading things that are always actual. If you study about existentialism, I hate existentialism. You don't very much, at least. Well, no, okay. It also, my crusade against existentialism, well, sometimes makes me too fanatic about it. But no, every philosophy is interesting, and in a way or another, existentialism is also something useful for everyone. It depends on which extremes. It's just like a perspective from which to solve things. Well, as long as you remain open to every perspective, but always knowing that there is one truth and that you can't really duplicate it at your will for your interests, well, that's kind of fine. And then, that's it. So you see great considerations you can draw from just a small, again, 5 lines of Vom Krige. So yeah, I think for today it's enough, and therefore for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.